Hello students, in this video I am just going to briefly break down how to satisfy the expectations for this week's learning assessment. So to start with, you can access the assessment in the same way that you've accessed every other learning assessment this semester. Just go ahead and download the Word document and then type your answers directly into the worksheet provided. Save that and upload it on Blackboard. If you do these things, you will be able to receive credit for your assessment. Now, once you have gotten your Word documents downloaded, the first thing you're going to see is the sort of chart, right? Which you should recognize from lecture as a version of the ideological grid, the four-cornered ideological grid that we use to discern and distinguish between different types of ideologies today. Now, basically what you're going to be doing in this assessment is figuring out where on this four-cornered ideological grid you would be located based on your positions, your feelings about these issues. All right. Now, I'll break that down a little bit further, but before we get into this, I do want to briefly note that if you're not comfortable sharing your own political views, that's totally fine. On the first hand, I'm not going to know whether you're telling me the truth or lying when you say I agree strongly or disagree strongly with any of these particular issue positions. But in addition to that, I've provided an option which will allow you to complete this assessment as though you were a current senator in the United States federal government. Okay, so if you don't want to share your views, simply go to On the Issues, look up any senator in the U.S. federal government, and then, using the information provided, you're going to go ahead and complete this assessment as though you were that senator. If you do choose to use this option, note that question 4 will have you tell me what senator you selected and provide a URL linking me to that senator's profile on the Issues website. All right? Okay, so let's just go ahead and assume that you are comfortable sharing your political views with the understanding that, of course, I don't actually care what you believe. I just want you to understand your own ideology and that the way you respond to each of these prompts will not affect your grade. Okay, so you are comfortable doing this. Well, basically, the first step that you're going to need to take is to identify which ideology corresponds to which of the four quadrants on this assessment's grid. Okay, I'll go ahead and do the first one for you. So this upper right-hand quadrant here is going to represent an ideology which tends to favor more social control and more economic control. So that's going to be authoritarianism or statism. You can use whichever term you like, but I'll actually go ahead and finish this one for you. So what you would do is you would come in here, highlight the text provided, and you would write out statism or authoritarianism, right? You'll do the same thing for each of the remaining four quadrants. You will tell me which one is conservative, which one is liberal, and which one is libertarian, and that will pretty much solve and satisfy the first step in this process, okay? Now, once you've labeled each of the four quadrants, the next step is for you to come down here and look at the following statements. So the first statement, for example, says the government should restrict same-sex marriage. Your job at this point in the assessment is to tell me whether this statement has to do with a social or an economic issue. So is same-sex marriage a social or an economic issue? And you can go ahead and indicate whether it is social or economic simply by deleting the incorrect answer. So in this instance, I'm going to go ahead and tell you that yes, same-sex marriage is a social issue. So in the parentheses provided, I am going to go ahead and make sure that I have yielded the correct answer, social, right? I'll go ahead and solve the second one for you as well. This is going to be an economic issue. So you will go through this exact same step for each of these issues until you have identified each issue based on whether it is social or economic. Once you've done that, the next step is to assign a number from this number line to the issue in question. So, in this instance, what we're going to find is that -3 is strongly disagree, -2 is disagree, -1 is somewhat disagree, 0 is no opinion, 1 is somewhat agree, 2 is agree, and 3 is strongly agree. Okay? So just for the sake of this example, I'm going to stick with positive numbers, and I'm going to focus on agreement, right? So let's say that I strongly agree with the statement. In that case, what I would do is I would put a +3 right next to the corresponding position statement. That tells me that I strongly agree with the idea that the government should restrict same-sex marriage. The next question says the government should require a higher national minimum wage. Again, this is an economic issue. And let's say, for the sake of my example, that I agree very strongly with that statement. In that instance, once more, I would put a +3 in the corresponding slot. You'll go ahead and do this exact same thing for all of the issues provided on this chart. Once you've gone through the last of the issues, the next step is for you to use the numbers that you have provided in order to figure out which of the 4 quadrants you belong in. So what you're going to do is you're going to come here to this little indicator that I have provided in the middle of this chart. And you can move this indicator by left-clicking and dragging it and then releasing your mouse. Okay? So in this case, the first answer that I provided down below was +3. Now this is a social issue, so I'm going to be moving my marker, my indicator, along the social axis. I said +3. The numbers in the top half of this diagram are positive, so I'm going to be going up 3. Okay? So for a social issue, a positive number will move the indicator up. If the social issue's answer is negative, if you disagree, then you'll move the indicator down. But I said strongly agree, so I will go 1, 2, 3. I will move the indicator the number of spaces indicated by my response to this issue. And then I will leave it there. So it's currently sitting at 0, 3. Now, the next step is to proceed to the next issue. Once again, I have strongly agreed. So once again, I have a +3. But in this case, we're looking at an economic issue. And on economic issues, positive numbers move you to the right, whereas negative numbers move you to the left. So, taking where I left the marker, I will then move 1, 2, 3. That's going to put me at 3, 3. And if this was the last issue, that would mean that I am a statist or an authoritarian. Now, if you wind up in this quadrant, don't be upset. Statism and authoritarianism are not major ideologies in American politics, but they are valid perspectives that you're definitely allowed to hold. And, of course, this particular test is going to be based on a finite list of issues, so it won't be perfectly accurate. One thing that you could do if you felt that you didn't wind up in the right quadrant would be to come down, add a few other issues that you care about, and then answer those as well and continue moving your indicator until you wind up in what seems to be a more appropriate place. Okay? One way or the other, when you have finished moving your indicator according to how much you agree or disagree with each of the statements provided here, what you are going to do ultimately is move down to the next page. On the next page, you'll have instructions for the assessment as a whole and a series of questions that you are going to answer based on the end point for your indicator. So again, my indicator, wound up at 3, 3, which is in the statism or authoritarianism domain. So what that means for me is that I'm going to come down here and I will say, according to this exercise, my ideology is authoritarian or statist. Okay. Now, the next question says, do you have any tendencies leading you to straddle between two ideologies or lean towards an ideology outside of your own quadrant? If so, which ideology? So, in order to answer this, you are going to have to watch the video because I won't explain that inside the directions down here. Basically, if you wind up with within one notch of a particular axis, then you have moderate tendencies leading you in the opposite direction. Okay? So let's say, for the sake of example, that this quadrant represented libertarianism. It doesn't, by the way, but let's say for the example that it does. In that case, what I would say, how I would read this, would be that I am an authoritarian, that I am a statist with some moderate libertarian leanings. Now, if I wound up at exactly 2, if my economic score was 0, and at the end of the day, I was on a positive 2 for the social axis, well, that would tell me that I am straddling between libertarian and statist, okay? In which case, I will come down here and I'll say, according to this exercise, I am a moderate between libertarian and statist, okay? Now I'm going to go ahead and delete this text because you'll put your own answer in its place. But then, on the second question, it asks, do you have any tendencies leading you to straddle between two ideologies or lean towards an ideology outside of your quadrant? In this case, I would say, yes, I straddle the line between, and then I would indicate which two quadrants my indicator happened to be touching once I had completed the assessment above. After that, you're going to reflect a little bit on your results, and you're going to tell me in question 3 whether or not they surprised you. Okay? You can do the same thing if you are answering these questions on behalf of a senator. If you thought the senator was very conservative and he or she wound up in a liberal domain, then tell me that and explain why you thought he or she would be liberal, and then use that to tell me whether you think this assessment, this ideological test, is an accurate indicator of where the senator actually falls. Does that make sense? Okay, great. Now, there's one final thing I'll show you before I close out of this video. Down here on the 3rd page of the Word document provided with this week's assessment, you're going to find that I have provided a detailed grading rubric which will explain point for point what you have to do in order to get a perfect score on this assessment. So be very careful in filling out this chart, in identifying whether the issue statements correspond to a social or economic issue, and in responding to each of the questions. If you do so, then there should be no reason why you cannot get a perfect score on this particular assessment. One final warning. The way that I have laid out this diagram is not going to fit perfectly with the way that it is laid out in lecture or in your textbook necessarily. So to adequately figure out which quadrant corresponds to which ideology, you need to understand which ideologies want more social control and which ones want less social control, which ones want more economic control and which ones want less economic control. So, for example, I know that this quadrant is statist because I know that statists want more social control and more economic control. What that means then is that in order to figure out who goes in this bottom right quadrant, I'm going to have to figure out which ideology tends to prefer more economic control but less social control. For the bottom left quadrant, I need to figure out which of the major ideologies supports less economic control and less social control. To figure out who goes in the top left, I need to figure out which of the ideologies favors more social control but less economic control. Okay, now don't forget that you can always email me or use the questions and answer forum on Blackboard if you have further questions. Good luck, have fun with this assessment. It should